Good evening. Exclusive tonight, hiding the truth, how authorities knew asylum seekers were heading for our shores long before it was made public. Those details coming up. Visas for Palestinians in just 1 hour, the astonishing admission from officials, the explosive details in a moment. Also tonight, are we ready for war with China? Shadow Defence Minister Andrew Hastie will join me live. And breaking his silence, the mushroom poisoning survivor speaks out for the first time since that deadly lunch. But first tonight, I can reveal the Albanese government didn't tell the public about the boat arrival of asylum seekers for a matter of days before the news broke on Friday. The Prime Minister said he was caught unaware about the arrival on the West Australian coast on Friday afternoon. But a day earlier, on Thursday, there was widespread knowledge of the illegal arrivals among Defence personnel. A source contacted me about the illegal boat arrival on Thursday evening, saying, and I quote, "I'm led to believe that illegal boats are arriving and the Army is involved in managing it and keeping it quiet." I hadn't yet verified this tip-off, but then it was only on Friday afternoon that the Prime Minister found out, apparently in the middle of a press conference.
I've been travelling in the car, so I'm not. I haven't been advised about that. But our policies are very, very clear. Our policies are clear, which is that boats that arrive in that fashion, we have policies in place to ensure that they're dealt with.
Now, it's understood the illegal boats arrived at least on Thursday, potentially even Wednesday. When I asked Home Affairs about this today and whether the first boat arrived on Wednesday, they refused to comment, saying, and I quote, "As this operation is ongoing, no further information is available." Well, the operation is not ongoing, it's done. The asylum seekers are now in Nauru Detention Centre. So this seems to be a classic cover-up response. Confirming which day the asylum seekers arrived, if they even know this information, does not jeopardise national security. It would only embarrass the government and the authorities for their incompetence. Clearly, something is not working in the national security apparatus when an illegal boat can bypass surveillance, maritime and border security and authorities for up to 2 days before anyone is any wiser. The Prime Minister should know immediately if there is a boat arrival. You have to ask, how can a journalist find out about this before the PM? Shadow Immigration Minister Dan Tehan had this to say on Peter Credlin's show earlier.
It seems like they've been able to get these asylum seekers in onto the coast. They've told them to wait for 2 or 3 days before they then move, and they've then been able to go. And there is no trace of them.
Now, it's been reported that the asylum seekers who arrived in the remote WA community said they were trying to get to Sydney. This would add more pressure when immigration has already been increased by $500,000 a year and we're in a cost of living crisis. The arrival of boats just months after hardened criminals were released into the community as a result of that High Court ruling is highly damaging for the Prime Minister. Anthony Albanese knows this is dangerous political territory, which is why he launched a scathing tirade against Peter Dutton today. He accused him of being angry, negative, and only doing soft television interviews.
So angry about so many things, Peter Dutton, in life. So angry. Everything is overblown. There is no issue too big for him to not show how small he is and the lack of vision which is there. He's always aggressive, always negative, and nothing positive to say.
The Prime Minister clearly trying to deflect from his own government's failings on border security. And he went on to accuse Peter Dutton of never doing proper television or media interviews. But when does the Prime Minister ever subject himself to serious scrutiny? Well, he doesn't. He mostly goes on FM radio stations for soft-touch interviews. Now, in order to try and neutralise the potent political attack, The Australian Border Force on the weekend reportedly called for Peter Dutton to stop attacking the government over these boat arrivals, warning that this could be a pull factor. Now, for what it's worth, coalition sources believe that Labor would have asked Border Force to publicly make that comment. This is ultimately an extraordinary demand from the head of Border Force, asking the opposition leader not to criticise government policy on immigration. It's the government's responsibility to have tough policies that mean boats don't arrive. That is solely the government's responsibility. And if they don't, and if it's putting the lives of refugees at risk, and if it's putting our national security at risk, then it's Peter Dutton's obligation to hold the government to account and to call for stronger border policies. And he did so today on Channel 7, 9 and at a press conference. He spoke about how aerial surveillance of our borders has been cut back. He also claimed that Operation Sovereign Borders has effectively been dismantled with the abolition of temporary protection visas.
They're now sending a green light to people smugglers when the news is distributed by the people smugglers that 149 criminals who are non-citizens and have committed terrible crimes can be released from immigration detention into the community for a permanent outcome in our country.
Well, with the release of those 149 criminals into the community and the High Court's November ruling that indefinite detention is unlawful, we should hardly be surprised that the boats have started coming again. If the government had used its new laws to throw some of these criminals back behind bars, this would have sent a clear message to people smugglers. But not one application was made by Albanese or his ministers. These are the clear pull factors, and the people smugglers can exploit the High Court's ruling that indefinite detention is unlawful to encourage people, families even, to take the perilous journey. And it is perilous. As you'll recall, 1,200 men, women and children tragically drowned under Labor between 2008 and 2013 trying to reach our shores. And during that time, around 50,000 people came on boats. The Australian newspaper's editorial today reported that there's now sugar on the table for people smugglers to exploit, with increasing numbers of would-be asylum seekers on the move and eager to access Australia from Pakistan, Bangladesh and other countries. And on top of this, there's the weak Immigration Minister, Andrew Giles. I told you last week how he'd previously said no one should be in immigration detention. And then radio host Ray Hadley today reported that Andrew Giles was the lawyer who represented the 433 asylum seekers trying to get to Australian shores on the Tampa in 2001.
And I'd remind everyone, the Immigration Minister, Andrew Giles, if you're old enough like me to remember Tampa in 2001 when 433 Afghans were on that Norwegian freighter and John Howard said, "You're not coming here," they were represented in court by Andrew Giles.
It makes you wonder why any Prime Minister would appoint someone with that history to this portfolio. This is an Immigration Minister who's a history of being soft on border protection. And both Albanese and Andrew Giles argued strongly against boat turnbacks. With the socialist left faction of the Labor Party in control, it was only a matter of time before the illegal boats started again. Now, the illegal boat arrivals are the least of our concerns when it comes to Labor's immigration policies. Do you remember late last year when we were all so perplexed that so soon after the October 7 terror attacks, Penny Wong started handing out visas to Palestinians to come to Australia from Gaza? At the time, the ABC reported that 860 Palestinians would be granted visas. And on this program, we questioned how security checks could be done so quickly, when ASIO has previously said these can take months. Well, the Albanese government has quietly nearly tripled the number of Palestinians they're bringing into Australia. From October 7th, And those are the terror attacks, remember. From October 7th until the 6th of February this year, 2,273 people who hold a Palestinian Authority travel document, so 2,273 Palestinians, have been given visas to Australia. And let me tell you, the security process is worse than any of us could have imagined. We've spoken about how security checks are essential because we need to make sure that the Australian government isn't flying into Sydney and Melbourne and our other major cities people who have links to Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, or any other terror group. Well, Foreign Minister Penny Wong assured us repeatedly in multiple television interviews that rigorous security checks were being done. Well, her comments were incorrect, because officials have revealed in Senate estimates that far from rigorous security checks, which, as ASIO has said, can take months, these visas were being approved in a single day, one day. Have a look.
Between 7th of October and 31st of December 2023, the Department granted 2,127 visitor visas to people declaring Palestinian citizenship, and an additional 148 migration and temporary visas were granted.
What's the average processing time for a visa like this?
Globally, for a visitor visa, the median processing time is 1 day.
1 day. And that was, by the way, Shadow Home Affairs Minister James Paterson doing that questioning. He did a sensational job. But if that's not disturbing enough, 1 day, some visas for Palestinians were apparently granted in an hour. Have a look again.
But there was also a media report by the ABC on the 9th of December entitled "Australians Turn to WhatsApp Group for Help to Get Family Members Out of Gaza," in which some individuals claimed their visitor visa for relatives were approved within 1 hour.
It is possible.
Sure, but how could you possibly do all the necessary security and other checks in just an hour from an applicant? I mean, that's lightning speed approval.
When we apply that vast range of information to consideration of visitor visas, so if you look globally, a very large number of our visitor visas would be done inside an hour. The assessment is essentially looking at all the information we hold and applying that in a number of ways to the application in front of us.
I think we can confidently say that the appropriate security checks are not being done. They can't possibly be done if they're only taking an hour. Now, remember, Penny Wong went on every television show. Sunrise, Today Show, she held a press conference. She confidently reassured the public that rigorous checks were being done. Well, we asked her office if she was misleading the Australian public when she made these comments. Here's what her office told us just this afternoon. This is best directed to the Department of Home Affairs. What a joke. What a joke. This is our Foreign Minister. The idea that all Palestinians are innocent is obviously naive. Of course, there are many innocent Palestinian citizens who are unwitting victims of Hamas, families who hate the terror group and who would be desperate to escape. But there are also many Palestinians who do agree with Hamas, who have been indoctrinated to hate Jews and Westerners, and many citizens took part in the Hamas invasion of Israel on October 7, and many Palestinians celebrated those terror attacks. There were Palestinian citizens looting Israeli homes and even taking hostages. Now, we have no idea whether some of the Palestinians that our government has granted precious visas to are actually Hamas terrorists themselves, desperate to flee because of the pressure from the IDF, because Israel is winning. Australian Jewish Association's David Adler points out that some surveys have shown there's up to 75% support for Hamas among Palestinians. And he says it's inconceivable that appropriate security screening has been undertaken. He told me today that the Labor government is exhibiting a reckless disregard for the safety and security of Australian citizens. It is almost certain Australia is importing Hamas supporters and those who celebrated the 7th of October terrorism. He says it's impossible, it is possible, that we are bringing in Hamas members and operatives. We may even be bringing in some who participated in or assisted the 7 October terrorism. Now, we know that Jews are already being persecuted in Australia. Anti-Semitism is rising. There's doxing, death threats, vandalism, hatred and intimidation. Aggressive protests outside of Jewish synagogues, homes and businesses. The last thing we need is Hamas sympathisers to be flown into Australia, undoubtedly at taxpayer expense, to further put at risk the safety of all Australians and to further erode social cohesion. Life in Gaza is nothing like life in Australia. Here, we need to protect our safety, our security, our peace, our way of life. It's precious, and as we've sadly learnt in recent months, it's fragile. We can't risk it by possibly bringing in terrorism, violence and hatred. You'd think if you were granting visas to 2,273 people from a war zone like Gaza, you take extra care to ensure that terrorist sympathisers or even Hamas operatives weren't being brought into our peaceful cities. But the reality is that Penny Wong and DFAT could be providing safe passage to Australia for terrorists or terrorist sympathisers. It's unacceptable that visas are being approved within 1 day and potentially 1 hour. This inadequate security screening isn't just a threat to Jews, it's a threat to all Australians. All right, joining me now to discuss this and the other top stories of the day, Sky News host Liz Storer. Welcome, Liz.
Hello, hello.
And contributor Joe Hildebrand. Great to see you both.
Love to see you. How are you?
Liz, look, I have to ask you about this story before we get on to some of the other topics. It's astounding. I mean, if it wasn't admitted at Senate estimates, if you didn't just hear that official, and that's why I had to show the clip, saying yes, possibly 1 hour, I mean, it would take weeks and weeks to work out, and we don't have a presence on the ground in Gaza, whether someone does have terrorist sympathies or participated in the terror attack itself.
Sadly, I don't find it that shocking at all, Sharri, given that our Foreign Minister has shown time and time again where she really stands with regard to this conflict. It doesn't skip anyone's mind that she doubled funding to UNRWA before the terrorist attacks. Obviously, she's since withdrawn them due to the incomprehensible pressure that was placed upon her. She's still got people, even on the front bench, asking her to reinstate that. I don't think for a minute that she's unaware of the risk that she's importing. David Adler's quite right in saying that 75% of Palestinians, there was a very comprehensive poll done, supported the October 7 massacres. Here in Western democracies, we do not have any kind of point of reference for life in Gaza and the kind of indoctrination that goes on there. When we talk about this tiny strip of land, we are talking about one of the most intensely indoctrinated parts in the known world. And so to think that they have somehow managed to find 2,273 people who have not been indoctrinated to support Hamas or celebrate what occurred on October 7, who aren't bringing their ideology with them, who are totally open to the Western way of life and just completely relieved and grateful to make it here, is simply beyond belief. It doesn't pass the pub test, and that's before we find out that this sad excuse for a security check is all they were vetted by.
It's terrible. Joe, I mean, we've always traditionally placed... You made people jump through hoops when they wanted to become an Australian citizen and try to prove that they adhere to Australian values. I mean, what's happened to that? That's gone out the window. Now we don't care if someone adheres to Australian values or not. Why are we giving away our cohesive multicultural society?
Look, it is obviously concerning, and I would probably say, firstly, it's amazing how quickly the bureaucracy can move when it wants to, isn't it? Anyone who's tried to get a new passport certainly takes more than an hour. My understanding, my I would assume that these visas that are granted in an hour or in a day or whatever it may be, it's not that they're taking that amount of time to do the security checks. It's that the person already has enough material information, as the official said, before them, where they can say, oh, actually, he's ticked all these boxes, it's all fine, blah, blah.
So they don't care if they're Hamas, they're just doing identity.
You need to take the time to vet those docs, though,
as I have always said, it is naive to think that you can just have a war against Hamas and not have a war against the broader Palestinian population, because through no fault of their own, they have been indoctrinated, they've been bombarded with propaganda. Terrorists are treated as freedom fighters and martyrs. They're given financial incentives by way of compensation. So it's in a mother's interest to tell her son to go and blow himself up at a checkpoint. So, of course, this does something to you. This screws you over enormously. So I think if you were going to say, well, we can't have any Palestinians come here who secretly in the back of their mind have any association with Hamas or have any sympathies for Hamas, then you might as well not have a sort of humanitarian program at all, because almost every one of them is going to at some point have that.
But also, Liz, what about the Arab neighbouring countries and nations?
Well,
why aren't they taking some of the... Why is it up to Australia, half a world away?
I believe this is because they know. They are familiar with life in Gaza. They are familiar with the indoctrination, and they too are very territorial in terms of guarding the peace that they have in their own countries. There are tens and tens of other Arab countries surrounding them, other Muslim countries surrounding them, in which they ought to be far made much more at home.
They want to use these people as human shields and use them as human fodder, so that inevitably when Israel does kill civilians to get at Hamas, they can then jump up and down and say, look, this is what the horrible Israeli colonisers are doing. This is why we have to wipe them out.
And I think that's part and parcel of it. But the world is also looking at them going, yes, but you're right next door and you could have saved them. We know Hamas is using them as human shields.
Even the Palestinians in the refugee...
These are far richer countries who have the means to take them in.
Even the Palestinians in the refugee camps in Palestine don't want to leave them because they feel that that would forfeit their claim. So again, these are people who are using themselves or being used manipulated by Hamas, by other Islamist extremist organisations to try to perpetuate this sort of historical victimhood, so that they can't go back, because they still have to say, see, I'm still stuck in this refugee camp, 3 generations later, because of what Israel did in 1948.
All right.
That is the narrative there.
All right, we're going to keep on this story through the week. Let's have a look at another big story. The front page of the Sydney Morning Herald featured top education experts who've come out and said that the pandemic-era school closures were unnecessary, disruptive, and potentially will have long-lasting consequences for an entire generation of children. They say that there's now persistent behaviour issues and an attendance crisis continues to plague our schools. This was an important report, Liz, and I know, many parents know that in so many different ways, whether it's mental health, whether it's being behind on education studies, spending that much time away from schools, particularly in Melbourne, has had a major impact.
Look, I love that this is coming out now, but the idea that they never knew and they could never have known and they just had to do it for the greater good is utter tripe. When you look at countries like Sweden, who didn't shut down a single shop, didn't shut down a single school, they also didn't have any vaccine mandates, none of it. They are laughing all the way to the bank in terms of every single metric that is COVID related. There was almost zero suffering across the board. There was no massive outbreaks in schools. Nothing of the sort. And this is the whole idea of modelling. And we were lied to. There is no other way to see it, in my humble opinion. We were absolutely lied to say that all these things were necessary. And one by one, it's proving that it wasn't. Just today, across the ditch in New Zealand, the Court of Appeal has decided that the mandates weren't lawful for their police departments. We've seen this happen now in the UK, similar in Scotland. The truth is coming out. The schools are just I think what the schools are the most important thing.
I think leaving aside all the vaccine stuff, leaving aside all the
mandate stuff. But the idea that nobody knew, Joe, is an absolute joke.
It is absolutely clear that it was known that schools were safe. The New South Wales government's own analysis and research proved that, even as they were being shut down.
They lied.
Anastasia Palaszczuk, to her great credit, was about to keep schools open in Queensland before the Queensland Teachers Union had a stop work meeting, and suddenly the schools were unsafe based on the medical advice of the Teachers Union. And again, Victoria, just an absolute basket case where the government gaslit the entire population and where they still seem to have some weird sort of twitchy fear. But this is good on the Sydney Morning Herald for doing this.
Agreed.
This is an absolute disgrace, and I have been screaming about it. I'm not blowing my own trumpet, but the idea that no one knew or no one was told, I've been screaming about this since day dot. I saw another report in the Sydney Morning Herald years ago that found in public schools in New South Wales alone, 3,000 kids just never came back after the first lockdown. Just after the first. Those 3,000 kids, I don't know where they are. No one knows where they are.
Yeah. And where's the accountability?
This is people love to chop up and down and talk about genocide. This is almost the genocide of the most disadvantaged students in our school system who have basically just been left to the gutter because of pearl-clutching Karens.
Agree with you. Perhaps a bit of an exaggeration to say it's a genocide in our schools, but I agree with your point,
say
Joe.
People like to see
not a good time to throw around that word, Joe.
That's right.
Liz Storer, Joe Hildebrand, thank you so much. We'll see you later tonight, Liz, at 10 o'clock. Now, the hunt for Malaysian Airlines flight MH370 was the biggest and most expensive search in history, but ultimately it's been a failure. And a senior official who was part of the search has told Sky News in a new investigation he knew early on that they were looking in the wrong place.
We covered that area in such a level of detail that I just don't think it's plausible that we missed the aircraft.
Were you looking in the right area?
Well, initially in the southern Indian Ocean, no.
And tomorrow night, Pete Stefanovic will bring you a groundbreaking documentary into MH370, 10 years on from its mysterious disappearance. It will be on in this time slot, 7:30 p.m. tomorrow night for an hour, and Pete Stefanovic joins me now. Pete, congrats on your documentary. It's incredible. Look, you actually interviewed some of the families of those who are still missing. They still don't have answers. What did they think happened?
They're actually keeping an open mind, Sharri. Good evening to you. I asked them, I interviewed them a couple of years ago for a previous documentary, and I asked them then if they were willing to point the finger at the pilot, Captain Zaharie Shah, and they told me years ago that they weren't going to do that just yet because they didn't have all the facts. So this time around, I've interviewed them again to see if they've changed their mind, and they haven't. They're still willing to give the pilot the benefit of the doubt until they've got everything squared away. This is despite the fact that most of the evidence, if not all of it, suggests that this was mass murder-suicide by the pilot. They're still not willing to go there yet, and it just helps them in their grieving process. So, whatever works for people, that's fine, but that's just how they're viewing things, and that view has not changed.
In terms of the actual search location, there's been a lot of different theories about where the plane could be. You think in this day and age it wouldn't be that hard to track down an entire plane and all the parts that go with it. Why has it been so difficult with all our modern technology to try and work out exactly where that plane would have disappeared and which part of the ocean it would have sunk?
There's a few ways to answer that. The first one is that, you're in the southern Indian Ocean. It's a place called the Roaring Forties. It is inhospitable. It is a very violent ocean, and the crafts, the vessels that were there looking for it originally had to deal with all of that. I mean, we're talking about big swell, and you've got the craft that had to go into areas that are very dark, very cold, very wild. So that in itself is very difficult. But probably the toughest break, I think, the Australian searchers had was that they started days after this plane had actually gone down. Because remember, they were looking in the South China Sea first. That's when the pilot turned off the transponder. So the assumption was that the plane had just gone down in the South China Sea. This is not long after takeoff from Kuala Lumpur. But it took a week, and that was through the help of satellites, that they realised, well, actually, no, the plane's gone down way over there. So by that time, 7 days had passed, you got a lot of debris. The debris field would have spread out in different areas, and it was just very difficult to track. And so that's why, by some benefit, I suppose, can be given to the ATSB, even though most people we've spoken to suggested that they got it wrong. They got the search zone wrong. You played a clip of Peter Waring there. He had suggested that they were looking in the wrong area, but they had blinkers on. They weren't going to change their view because they were working on the assumption that it was a death dive, that the plane ran out of fuel, the pilot wasn't in control at the end, and it just corkscrewed down into the ocean. But what they didn't factor in was the fact that the pilot was alive and he wanted to glide that plane as far as possible so that it wouldn't be found. And in that instance, he has been incredibly successful.
It's one of the greatest mysteries of our time. Pete Stefanovic, again, well done, and I'm sure everyone's looking forward to seeing it tomorrow night. So MH370 documentary tomorrow at 7:30 p.m. right here on Sky News. Now, coming up, as more asylum seekers land on our shores, we look at what crimes have been reported since the immigration detainees were first released. Plus, the plan to counter China. Andrew Hastie will join me next. Welcome back. Well, a convicted sex offender and former immigration detainee Emran Dad from Iran is the latest detainee to be charged by the federal police since his release. He allegedly engaged in sexually charged online chats with a 15-year-old girl on TikTok. At least 18 of the 149 former detainees have now been charged with state and territory offences since their release. Shadow Defence Minister Andrew Hastie joins me now. Welcome to the program, Andrew. Look, I reported at the start of the show that it appears that authorities in the Albanese government knew for a matter of days, potentially 2 days, before we all found out on Friday that there'd been illegal boat arrivals. I tried to ask Border Force about this today. They said it was an operational matter. Do you think there's a lack of transparency here and there's a problem with the fact that the Prime Minister didn't know until Friday afternoon when I was informed by someone on Thursday evening?
Sharri, it's a good question. I think there are two issues here. Number one is transparency, as you rightly raise, and then the second issue is the effectiveness of this government on national security matters. The first one, we know that the Parliament rose on Thursday evening, and I wonder if this information was withheld from the senior ministers in national security portfolio so as not to have it as an issue live within the Parliament on Thursday. But I do ask the question, how well is the National Security Committee of Cabinet operating? How well are they being briefed? And we know from the Minister for Immigration, Andrew Giles's case, he's hapless, he's shrinking under the crushing weight of office, he's unable to impose himself on the situation, as we've seen with the bungling of the NZYQ case and the release of almost 150 people into the community, some of which are murderers, sex offenders, pedophiles, there's even a contract killer. So I guess the key takeaway for your viewers tonight is that this is a very weak government on national security, but particularly border security.
I mean, what about the Prime Minister's excuse that, he didn't know about it because he was travelling in a car? I mean, we don't have phones now in cars? How believable is that he hadn't been briefed?
Well, his car is up armoured and he certainly doesn't drive it himself. He has a security detail who does that for him. So he would have had hands-free, and I assume he would have had his phone as well. And it would be easy enough for the Minister for Immigration, Andrew Giles, or the Minister for Home Affairs, Claire O'Neill, to pick up the phone and say, Prime Minister, we have another group of illegal arrivals off the northwest coast of Australia. It's important you know about it. But instead, he went blind into a press conference. And so you've got to ask yourself, who are briefing the ministers and why are the ministers not briefing the Prime Minister?
Now, Andrew, I want to ask you about potentially the most important story that emerged over the weekend globally. And this is, of course, Navalny's, we should say murder because it can only have been murder, Navalny's murder. He was, of course, Vladimir Putin's main rival. He'd spoken in many interviews previously about what would happen if he died, if he was killed. We don't officially know the cause of death. His spokesman says it was murder. Of course it was. Are you concerned about what's unfolded and the impact on democracy here? And also, just recently we've seen this element of the Republican Party kind of going quite soft on Russia, and it's inexplicable.
I think, Sharri, it's a really interesting question. I think what we're seeing on both sides of politics is what I'd call moral relativism. Things are seen only through tribal lenses, and that's why you're seeing some elements of the Republican right drawn towards Vladimir Putin, who is a murderous thug. We know that. We know what he's done in Ukraine. Thousands of people have died since he launched that illegal, unjustified war in 2022. He's been responsible for ordering assassinations around the globe, but particularly in places like the United Kingdom. And so sadly, Navalny's death, I think, looks like a murder or an assassination. And it goes to the very character of the Putin regime, which is authoritarian, anti-democratic, and absolutely hostile to minority voices.
Look, we're also seeing plans for our Navy here in Australia to invest in more equipment. This as the threat from China continues to loom. There's been chronic underinvestment in the defence space. Do you think this latest plan announced by Richard Marles is adequate?
We'll find out the details in the morning, and I haven't been briefed yet, but certainly since April last year, we know that this government has not been serious about our defence strategy or budget. There has been no new money since the Defence Strategic Review was handed down. This surface fleet review was meant to be short and sharp. Instead, it's been long and blunt. The Minister has had it for 5 months on his desk. And we now know through leaks into the press that the original 9 Hunter-class frigates which were to be built in Adelaide will be reduced to 6, which increases the cost per unit for each ship. So we're going to wait and see, but I think this is another broken promise from the Albanese government. And I think it also underscores the recruiting and retention crisis that we have in defence. We're not recruiting enough people into defence. I can tell you countless stories of people who want to serve but can't for a whole range of reasons which are ridiculous, and we're not retaining enough people. So the question is, if we expand our fleet, which we would welcome, how are we going to crew them? How are we going to crew our AUKUS submarines? And these are questions the government must answer.
Yeah, such an important issue. Andrew Hastie, thank you very much for joining me this evening. Now coming up, calls for a booze ban in Parliament grow louder after yet another incident of a politician enjoying one too many while at work. Also, Albanese's bizarre stunt today. That's after this quick break. Well, the media scrutiny that Barnaby Joyce has faced since he was filmed rolling on the street in a drunken state has been at odds with how the ABC ignored completely Lydia Thorpe's drunken antics when she was abusing people outside a Melbourne strip club last year. The Australian newspaper's Media Diary today reported that the ABC has a clear double standard and that even Paul Barry, the Media Watch host, criticised the public broadcaster for failing to properly report on Lydia Thorpe last year.
Were the critics right? Was the ABC staying mum? Answer, yes. Aside from some brief mentions, there was nothing in an ABC News bulletin or online. And that is pathetic, given that it's the ABC's job to hold our elected representatives to account.
So the ABC ignored Lydia Thorpe, but then has been going very hard on Barnaby Joyce over the past week. And now, as you know, the Deputy Leader of the Nationals, Perrin Davey, has admitted that she had a couple of drinks before a committee hearing last Tuesday evening, despite the fact that she helped write the new alcohol and drugs policy for Parliament House. Well, joining me now for our Political Insiders panel is former Chief of Staff to Bill Shorten and current Director of GXO Strategies, Cameron Milner, and former Press Secretary to Scott Morrison and Director currently at Headline Advisory, Andrew Carswell. Welcome to you both. Cameron, look, we're now seeing the Teals say that we need alcohol and drug testing in Parliament House. You've spent more time than I gather anyone would have liked to at Parliament House. Do you think this is actually necessary?
Absolutely, it's necessary. I mean, Parliament House has to be a workplace of the 21st century, and if it's good enough on a mine site or a construction site to have zero tolerance to not only alcohol but also illegal drugs, then Parliament House has got to be the same. Parliament House can't be a party house. I am really worried about the use of illegal drugs. I mean, alcohol's one thing, but illegal drugs in Parliament House is a real issue, and that has to be tested. And my view is it should be mandatory for MPs, and if they've got nothing to fear, they've got nothing to hide, then they should do it, because I'm really concerned about the use of illegal drugs, not just alcohol, amongst our MPs and amongst staffers in Parliament House.
Of course, without naming any names, but this is behaviour that you're saying you're aware of. Cameron?
I'm not going to name names, but I've had it put to me that cocaine is a party drug. Well, no, sorry, it's a profit centre for organised crime. And people who are lawmakers shouldn't be allowed to break the law so complicitly.
I completely agree, and the change in attitude towards all type of drugs, particularly because the Labor governments in ACT and New South Wales and Victoria seem intent on decriminalising it, is partly responsible for this shift in attitudes. Andrew Carswell, what do you think about this? Do you think there's too much of a party culture in Parliament House? Do you think too many politicians are forgetting their responsibilities and getting drunk or even taking drugs?
Oh, I don't think it's as bad as it once was, Sharri, and I think that inroads have been made there and rules have been put in place to crack down on excessive behaviour. And that's what we're talking about here, excessive behaviour being the problem. I think we should definitely be cutting our politicians some slack, though. We do ask a lot of them. They're away from their families half the year, they work around the clock, their engagements, their diary engagements are extensive, they're under a lot of pressure. If you're having one or two glasses of wine and heading back into work, well, for those that have done that, you can't pick up a stone and throw at people like Perrin, because it's a slippery slope. If we're banning having a drink at Parliament House, well, then you have to ban all the functions as well. You have to ban the ABC's speeches during the week where media and political leaders and business leaders go and have a wine. Let's scrap it all if you're going to scrap it just for politicians.
Cameron, very quickly,
But if it's good enough on a mine, if it's good enough on a mine site, good enough on a mine site to be safe, good enough in a construction site to be safe, Parliament should be safe too, and it should be safe from alcohol and safe from illegal drugs.
They're driving trucks. They're in a dangerous environment. I mean,
and they're making laws, Andrew. They're making laws.
The most dangerous thing you can do in Parliament House is trip over a cord.
Well, that's physically, but if you think of cabinet ministers, they are sitting on classified information, making decisions that affect all of us. So you'd want those decisions probably to be made at a sober state of mind. Although you have to wonder sometimes with some of the laws that this government is passing. Now, to another political stunt that I'm keen to get both of your views on. The Prime Minister today challenged a man to get a tattoo on his arm of the GST promise to WA. Have a look at this.
Well, I've got a pen here if you want to sign it.
I've got pens. Here you go. Here you go. Give us your arm. Come on.
Andrew, it then turned out that the journalist used to work for Labor MP Patrick Gorman. So is this clearly a political stunt?
Oh, Sharri, I just thought it was awkward. He does these little gimmicks every now and again, and you sit back and think, what are you trying to do here? You're the Prime Minister. I think he suffers from that disease, that unfortunate disease of thinking you're actually cool when you're not, and you fail to see the eyeballs rolling back into people's heads. So it was a bit of a gimmick today. It was a bit of a stunt. Look, the GST annual show that happens in WA is a truly remarkable show. I'll give him that. It's a win-win situation where said Prime Minister goes from Canberra to WA and promises, pinky promise, that I will not touch the GST in any shape or form, whether that be what's dished out by Treasury or the extra bit on the top that comes with that as well. So it's a win-win situation.
Your former boss
WA
first
News
made.
get the news.
Promise Scott Morrison first made.
Because it is a political win over there. I mean, you stop a person on the street in Perth and they'll talk to you about two things: that the Eagles are crap and they're going to be crap for many years to come, and whether the politicians in Canberra are going to take away our GST money. It is a genuine live issue over there, and I'll never understand it, because you look out in the eastern states and they don't have any idea what we're even talking about now.
Cameron, I think Andrew Carswell's perception of the Prime Minister as thinking that he's cool is probably quite spot on. I mean, he likes to present himself as DJ Albo. I don't think Scott Morrison probably ever thought he was cool. His whole image was the daggy dad. Cameron, which one resonates better with the public?
Well, I mean, Albo's trying very hard, but can I say about the tattoo? Total stunt, total stunt. I mean, the Prime Minister, knows about laser tattoo removal, no doubt. I mean, he hasn't been able to sit down since he removed the I Heart Stage 3 from his body. So, look, no, the reality is that the broken promise and lasers can fix the tattoo, and it was a simple stunt from the Prime Minister. And honestly, we deserve better from our Prime Minister.
All right. Andrew Carswell, Cameron Milner, look forward to seeing you for the Political Insiders panel next Monday. Thank you both so much. Now, after the break, the sole survivor of the mushroom poisoning lunch speaks for the first time. Crime editor Mark Murray will join me to discuss this. Stay tuned. Welcome back. Well, it's been 7 months since that famous mushroom lunch that claimed 3 lives: Heather Wilkinson, Don and Gail Patterson. Well, Heather's husband, Reverend Ian Wilkinson, was hospitalised for 3 months, and today he spoke for the first time. It would have been the celebration of his 45th wedding anniversary.
Friday was my birthday, turning 70, and yesterday was our 45th wedding anniversary.
The Daily Telegraph's crime editor, Mark Murray, joins me now. Mark, thank you so much for your time. Look, this story has gripped the country. How much more do we know now, thanks potentially to the Reverend, about what happened at that mushroom lunch?
One thing we do know is that he's an incredibly forgiving man and has incredible faith. The details, I think we're going to have to wait quite a while before it all comes out. His sister-in-law has been charged with 3 counts of murder, and there's attempted murder on her former husband Simon as well, who didn't go to the lunch. So the details, I think, it'll become like one of the most fascinating trials, and a lot will come down to technology, and there'll be forensic experts. We heard at Senate's estimates the other day, the federal police sniffer dogs were used to go into the house, and they actually found computers and hardware technology that's going to possibly form part of the case. So I think everybody will be watching. I don't think it's just grabbed the nation. I think it's got headlines internationally as well. It's just such an unusual, it's alleged murder weapon, poison. It's just, you don't hear these cases very often at all. In 40-odd years, the number of poisoning allegations against somebody are very, very rare.
Yeah. I imagine that's your 40-odd years. You don't look old enough, Mark Murray, but you have been covering the gang wars in Sydney over your time as a crime journalist at the Daily Telegraph. You've got a new documentary series. There's details about the current chaos on the streets of Sydney. Quite extraordinary detail. You put your own life at risk to cover this. Tell us what this goes into and who are the latest gangs that we should be worried about.
Well, it's some of the same old players, although, the last series we did was the Alameddines and the Hamsies, and in effect the Hamsies had been wiped out. They've lost so many people who were killed. At the moment, we still have the Comanchero, the Alameddines, but we actually now explore that there's not a new family, but a family that's risen, the Houcher family. Now, some of these hits were extraordinary, and we actually revealed today that Alan Moradian, a senior member of the Comanchero and what we call the Commission, who tried to control the price and flow of drugs around the country, he was taken out, but he was the one that allegedly, had ordered a hit on a fellow friend who then got in before him and got him killed, and that's the allegation. That shows you how treacherous these guys can be. We also explore the fact that while we had a little lull in early last year, we had an amazing array of kidnappings where people had their fingers and toes removed.
Jeez.
One woman was kidnapped, driven 3 hours out of town, had parts of her fingers cut off, tied to a tree and left there. And it took her 30 hours before she could escape.
Mark Murray, that is, I think, too gruesome even for nighttime television, but we look forward to seeing your documentary. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And thanks for your company tonight. Stay tuned. Paul Murray's got a great show, so don't miss it.